All right, everybody. Welcome to Building SaaS on AWS, the flagship show for SaaS on Twitch. And it's brought to you by the AWS SaaS Factory. My name is Bill Tarr, and I am a SaaS evangelist with the SaaS Factory. So if you're building SaaS, or even if you're just on your journey to learning about building SaaS, this is the show for you. Every week, we feature episodes that have SaaS experts who are building SaaS, talking about specific technologies that can help you build SaaS, or even talk about the business aspects of why you want to build SaaS and what the rationale is for justifying SaaS. So this week, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Justin and Hiran. They're from Simform. And before I let them introduce themselves, I want to say something about Simform. They're one of our newest SaaS competency partners. They really just joined us a little while ago, really excited about having the opportunity to work with them. Our SaaS competency program is actually really small. It's under 40 companies that have been vetted for their expertise in being able to build, architect, and operate SaaS on AWS. So this is a very elite group of SaaS builders. I'm really excited to have Justin and Hiran on today to talk about building SaaS on AWS and tell us what they've built, talk about their customers, and we're going to talk through some interesting use cases of how they approach SaaS. So with no further ado, Justin, why don't you start? I'd like to hear a little bit about what you're doing today, but especially, Justin, I really want to hear more about your background because I think you've got a fascinating background that our viewers are really going to enjoy hearing about.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I'm Justin Mitchell. I am COO at Simform, but I am an ex-founder, CEO, CTO, all of the things. I've been doing this for a long time, building SaaS startups. I was very fortunate enough to have an early exit when I was 19. I IPO'd my first startup. That was not a SaaS. It was a biometric security company, very boring, but I got lots of patents out of it. So it was a good learning experience. And then my latest venture, I raised $10 million for. That was a B2B SaaS. And that company is out there still being run by my co-founders. But kind of my fun connection to Simform is over the course of those 13 years of building all those startups, I was actually a customer of Simform. They were building all these companies for me. They were my backbone. I had a very thin team, me and a couple other people, and then boom, Simform on the background. And so they've been building all these companies for many years for me. Obviously, that led to a lot of really successful exits for me. And so over the course of working with them for so long, I decided, wow, I think I'd actually like to work for them now. So I was telling somebody this the other day, and they pointed out that really that just means that I'm now paying myself, as it was just this circular motion of money that happened over the last 13 years. But it's been really cool to see Simform grow from about 6 people to about 1,200 people. And we love building products. We love building SaaS in particular. So yeah, that's just kind of a little snapshot on me.
That's great. Yeah, Justin, I think we're going to come back to this. I think a lot of people are going to want to hear about the companies you founded, especially the SaaS companies you founded. So if we have time, especially at the end, love to really dive into some of those and hear about your story. But first, I want to hear about one of the people that probably helped you build some of those companies and introduce Hiran and give him a chance to introduce himself. And Hiran, especially tell everyone where you're actually dialing in from today, because I think that's interesting in and of itself.
Hey, this is Hiran. Like I work as a CTO at Simform. I've been part of smaller group that Justin talked about. Like there were 7 to 8 people from there. Like right now we are like around 1,200 people within the organization.
Wow.
I've been part of this whole journey, like taking care of tech side of the business. And eventually we moved to cloud, and then then we really seen a larger growth within organization. And I am part of architecture design, building scalable solutions for the customer. So that's what I've been doing for Simform since long time. And I've been part of AWS ecosystem since 2014. From there, like we moved to the consulting partner, and now we are advanced partner. We're targeting to become premier partner for AWS. Yeah.
That's great. Well, it's great to actually meet both of you and have a conversation with you about what you're doing. Let's start off with a little bit more background on Simform. So, as I understand it, from what I know about you guys are a SaaS competency partner, which means you have expertise in building SaaS. But is it a specific industry that you focus on? Is it a specific type of company? How would you describe Simform at a very high level and in terms of what type of companies might be interested in working with you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in its easiest form, we're a product engineering company. We build products, and we build products that people love, and we build them from a user first perspective, first and foremost. So, we're not industry specific. We're not region specific, vertical, horizontal, whatever all those different angles might be. We really just we build it all, and we love what we do. A lot of kind of our special sauce comes from a client coming to us and saying, here's my business driver, like here are my customers, here are my clients, here's who I'm building for, help me marry that with a technical solution. And so we've been fortunate enough to have some great case studies across multiple industries. We've done things from live streaming e-commerce platforms to a really intense water park installation with IoT sensors all over the place, major hospitality and entertainment brand there. So that was a lot of fun.
Nice.
To mobile apps for startups and even crypto. Yes, we've built some crypto things for some YC companies before. So it's wide ranging for sure.
All right. Well, I think there's a couple things that we're going to want to come back to. I think IoT is one that I'm hearing a lot of, but I'm going to come back to that later. I heard live streaming there, and I haven't come across that many multi-tenant live streaming apps so far. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience in building that live streaming app with your customer.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting use case because it marries this e-commerce system with the live streaming. So we built live streaming platforms all the time, specifically in like fitness and entertainment, where you have one person that's streaming to a bunch of recipients. This was a little bit different though because it's an interactive live stream because it's a live purchasing platform. So people think QVC, right? You're selling things live on a video stream. People need to be buying those items very quickly. It's a very competitive buying process. So there's a live chat, there's purchasing that's happening, there's shipping and tracking of that shipment and all of the standard e-commerce systems that you have, but it all has to be real time. I mean, as near real time as you can possibly get it within milliseconds of a potential delay. And so we built this platform for this customer. And one of the cool things that came out of it is they came back to us and said, wow, this worked really well for us. Can you white label this for 400 other companies? And so what ended up happening is they'll come to us whenever a customer, signs with them and says, hey, here's their brand, here's their logo. And we go hit the big red button on our end and we deploy an entirely, siloed infrastructure to their AWS account for that customer, branded for them, customized for them. What's really neat is we have this really complex CI/CD setup where we can actually make customizations to one of their customers and it not mess up the main code base for their other customers or even their system itself, right? And it's really a great way for us to be able to do very custom things for each individual tenant. And we can then push all of those updates out to the individual tenants. And we allow all of those things to have full data separation. So, company A and company B, they're not sharing databases, they're not sharing data. So if they ever needed to pull a copy of their data, if anything ever needed an audit trail, we're never mixing data like that, but still running in the same AWS ecosystem because it's all underneath that one white label customer, and then they bill their customers, for that hosting. So it's a really cool platform. Probably one of the only ones I've seen that blends all those different angles of live streaming and e-commerce and full like shipment tracking. So we have connections to all like the parcel platforms to see like where in the shipment process is the package. Very, very neat platform, very intense. They came to us with older legacy code and said, hey, we need you to support this and modernize it. And so we've been doing that for about 5 years now with this customer. And they've had such a great experience with us that they actually just recently came back and said, hey, we want you to build the whole thing from scratch. This has been great. And we want a fresh, clean, brand spanking new architecture with all the learnings that we've had over the last 5 years. And we want you to build it, fresh for us. So we love this customer. They love us. And it's a really fun project to work on.
That's really awesome. So 500 customers, the onboarding story sounds like it's relatively frictionless, right? So you're able to onboard a customer You said the big red button. That's what I like to hear. I like to hear the big red button. Not, I go tell Heron and Heron tells 5 more people and they go click their own buttons. It sounds like it's all automated, and that automation story sounds pretty interesting. Do you want to dive a little bit? I know we're on customer stories right now, but I'd love to maybe click a little bit into
Heron,
that.
if you want to kind of dive into maybe what the big red button really means on the back end, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's a complete multi-tenant system. Basically, whenever we get any new customer within system, we have administration portal where we press the button, and behind the scene, we created all the Terraform templates, and just to deploy the whole new infrastructure for new white label customers. So that Terraform templates would deploy, will ramp up the new tenants, will connect that tenant with the master account that we would have, and it will have complete separate database, separate services, and everything has been configured using Intra as a code. We didn't initially, like when we started working on this product, like they had manual setup, right? So every time you get new customer, you need to create the server and plug it with your infrastructure. That was like kind of manual process, been taking a lot of time to ramp up the infrastructure, and it was not even scalable. So we containerize everything, and then we just created it as like using infrastructure as a code. When you press the button, it will just ramp up the whole infrastructure. So that's how basically we have implemented it.
I'm curious if there's any concept of a control plane here. Is there a central account somewhere where we're keeping track of all of our tenants and observability and everything else?
Yeah, so we do have that. Like we do have one master account. We followed, hub and spoke model. That is very popular strategy in this particular area where you have, multiple networks, and you can literally connect. You would have one host, and you can connect other, VPCs with that particular host, and you would be able to control all, security side of the things within the host account, and then there will be child account which will be specifically designed for each and every tenants.
Great.
So there is and then then we have like master account which controls all the cost part of it, all the policies part of it. That's where we defined all the security policies, etc. And tenant would take care of just services which belong to that particular tenant.
Perfect. We actually got a really interesting question here, because often when we talk about architecture, we talk about the day 0 and the day 1 story. Like, how do we get this stuff out? And then what happens after that? The day 2 story, sort of everybody forgets about. That's someone else's job. But this question's a really good one. How are you going to update all these changes? We've got 500 different, what I would call application planes out there, right? With all of these different tenants running in their own account. How do we roll out our updates to our system to all of those different accounts?
So this particular for this particular product, like we do have even a common product setup where everyone would be using the same kind of solution. There is no white labeling at all. That is like core product, and then there is more customized one, which would have like separate tenants and complete separate infrastructure. So like what we have done for them is like we have set up complete CI/CD. So there are pipelines for each and every tenants, and then there are pipelines for the core products. So when we would release any sort of core feature, it ultimately will be reflected for all the customers.
Right.
And then there are white labeling solution which which are getting deployed specifically for individual customers, and for them like there is a separate CI/CD pipeline been developed, but it's that all handled through Git, and just Git trigger, and that would trigger the pipelines basically.
Like a GitOps process. Are you following GitOps? Okay, perfect. Yeah. I think we're pretty common for what we see. I do want to hit. We're already getting some great questions here. This is a really interactive crowd today. So this is the tricky part of all of these updates, right? How do we handle database changes during our CD process when we have to actually update tables?
So we have pretty standard migration setup for all the database changes. So we don't manually apply anything into the database. It all goes through the CI/CD pipelines. So we have migration project. Whenever we would trigger deployment, migration will be executed first into the database, and then code will be deployed to the production for each and every customer, each and every tenant that I'm talking about.
Right. And because you have a single version of your code and a single version of your application, you're not managing lots of disparate versions. Part of the value proposition of SaaS, right? You got this single
That's
version of
correct.
the application, right? Yeah.
That's correct.
And I mean, I think it's a good question. I certainly do see some complicated scenarios with database updates. We could certainly dive into some of the real particular details, like not deleting columns, perhaps even tools like Liquibase, which I've used before for rolling updates. I think there's a lot of solutions to this, but I like your answer. I think just in general, really focusing on that common version and having a CI/CD pipeline that deals with the data first, then rolls out the application so that things are happening in sequence. Do you have any, but I mean, one interesting question that really would tie these two things together. What happens if we have to roll back? What's your rollback strategy when something does go wrong?
So that is again, we have designed a separate portal for just to manage all these operations, because, with white labeling, that scenario would become easily, complex. And then like you would have a lot of customer, you need to roll back literally anything at, when something happens. So we basically containerize everything, Dockerize everything. So we don't, just go ahead and deploy the code, but we deploy the containers, images within the cloud, and then those images are getting, deployed within the infrastructure. So it's all getting handled through EKS and, container registry
Nice.
within AWS, which ultimately would take care of, those sort of rollback scenarios, etc. So whatever we have deployed in the production can be rolled back easily with those, previous versions of those containers. So that's how we are, managing it. Again, we would have separate migration script for the rollback as well. So we have process defined for all the rollouts where we would have migration, and then we would have rollback migration. So in case if we need to roll back the system to the previous state, then we would apply the reverse migration on the system. So I mean,
the other
that's how we handle it.
The other thing that's helpful here, of course, is that we're starting from an infrastructure as code perspective, right? So we have these templates already set up. We can do version control on the tables. If we needed to revert to a different version of it, we just deploy the infrastructure as code, and boom, everything's basically set up correctly.
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people get lost in the weeds sometimes. Like, what's your strategy? How do you do it? Infrastructure as code. That's the right answer, right? You start with infrastructure as code. Right. And then your processes around that are what gets you to the final answers. Now, Justin, I think you probably thought I forgot about IoT and that I was going to let that go. I'm not going to let that go. I love talking about IoT and SaaS. We're seeing more and more SaaS customers talking about IoT. It seems like a real growth area for us. And I think you said you've got a customer who's used IoT. So let's talk a little bit about where you see IoT fitting in with SaaS and what use cases you've already seen.
Definitely. I'd say there's probably maybe two ways that you could look at IoT and SaaS. You have a SaaS IoT company. That is what they do. Think about something as silly as almost like a Fitbit, right? Those little IoT sensors that we all have on our hands and feet and rings, all that stuff now. That is their entire business. It's an IoT sensor. But a lot of times what we think about with a lot of our customers is also an IoT enabled SaaS, right? Where you've got like a SaaS solution and we're putting an IoT solution inside of that that's going to enhance it and, create value for the customer. So, one of the examples that I could give right off the rip here is, a parking app that we built. We have two actually parking IoT projects. One uses cameras to actually view the spots in a parking lot to see what's available or not. So using computer vision to actually analyze what's available, what's not, who pulled in, who left, all those things. And then we also have a license plate reader that'll actually determine when someone enters and when they exit for like billing purposes. It also runs analytics on the license plate to determine like the make and model of the vehicle. So we can determine sort of clientele for the customer, like who is using these parking lots and what kind of cars are they driving. And so that's kind of a great example of where we took a company that didn't really previously have IoT as a strategy. And they were a kind of valet and parking management solution. They sold that solution to hotels and parking garages and event spaces, and they needed a better way to kind of run analytics and have a better understanding of their data. And so we actually built all of their stuff from the ground up. There's mobile apps for the consumers. There's an entire admin panel for them to manage all their different tenants. And then we added this IoT layer on top where they're actually getting this rich data from all these camera systems that we have deployed at the different locations. All that stuff's going back to the cloud, running a bunch of analytics on it, and then pushing all that data down to the system that we built for them. So it's a really cool example of how you can take something that maybe doesn't scream IoT right out of the box, and then you can apply an IoT kind of solution to it. All of a sudden, it becomes a way more powerful SaaS. You've got a lot more rich data, and we're able to use a lot of that information to, increase business opportunities, I suppose. I did a project with, we were talking about where Hiran is calling in from in Dubai. I used to fly out to Dubai every single year for 5 years straight because one of our biggest clients was one of the larger airline companies in Dubai. And what we built for them was this IoT enabled, actually AR system for them to view their entire airport terminal. And then using the sensors in the terminal, actually determine where are the hot spots in the terminal, where are people hanging out the most, at what times during the day, where do we need to send cleanup crews to be able to mop in certain areas because the foot traffic is much higher there. Are there ways that we should optimize the retail locations, the food locations, because a bunch of people in this one area and there's nothing for them to do in that area? Could we increase revenue by placing things differently? So it's a lot of really cool ways where you can take a problem that doesn't necessarily already have an IoT solution, apply IoT to that, and then when you connect it to the cloud and you get everything interconnected like that, really some business magic can happen.
That's great. Now, if I came to you today, Justin, and said, "Hey, I've got this new IoT SaaS customer," maybe just from a technology standpoint, where would you start this conversation on IoT? And it might be different. You said this airline customer you've been working with for a few years. If you were starting today, some of our customers might be. Where would you point them in terms of that IoT stack and where you get started?
Yeah, I think for me, first, I would really try and understand the industry. Amazon's got some fantastic IoT stuff specific for like manufacturing and industrial IoT. And then they
Right.
have more for like your smart home and consumer level IoT. But there's a lot of really great cloud management systems on AWS platform. Hiran, did you want to maybe talk about something that we've used in the past?
Yeah, so we prefer to use AWS IoT Core. It takes care of literally, everything, like right from, device provisioning, analytics around your real-time data that you are getting from, all these devices, and then moving those data to the other services within AWS ecosystem where you would have, databases or any other, real-time services which has been connected with the can be connected with IoT Core. So literally, like we use AWS IoT Core for a lot of this system. Also Greengrass for edge processing and edge computing.
Site-wise
So
as
that is
well.
very Sitewise it ultimately provides real time insight about whatever data that you are getting from all these devices, which is like pretty helpful for industrial IoT use cases.
That makes sense. I'm kind of curious. There's different terminology out there for multi-tenancy. Our team tends to talk in terms of silo versus pooled. Just for anyone who's listening, silo is just a full stack. I get a stack, Justin gets a stack, Aaron gets a stack. And pooled, hey, maybe all of us are using the same infrastructure. And I'm kind of curious with IoT Core, if you've come across or you've built any pooled solutions that multiple customers might be using the same IoT Core solution.
Yeah, so I mean, we work with one of the vending machine company. They build thousands of vending machine, and they got a lot of this game has been deployed different at different locations like airports, malls, etc., etc. And like this is well distributed system where different people would take care of different region, managing maintenance, etc., etc. of those vending machines. So like visibility of those vending machines and like all the data that we are getting within the cloud from those machines about different activities like payments, etc., etc. So all management would be done within cloud, but it's divided into multiple tenants according to distributors and different people who gonna take care of that particular part of the region to manage, all the vending machine has been deployed within that region. So that's what we have built using the cloud, but we followed the same strategy within, cloud infrastructure, created infra as a code. And like I'm talking about management portion of it, but nothing like IoT core stays the same for majority of them, but it's not visible to them. They got just, the front end piece of it where they can manage all the devices and things like that. So that's how it's been divided. But at the data level, we have separate, schemas has been defined within the single database. We didn't wanted to, expose one tenant data to the another one. So that was like security requirement from the, product side, and we wanted to make sure that, at the database level, even we don't store everything within single DB table. So that's how, like at that level, we have separated out all those things, and we
Right.
have defined the schemas, and then only authorized people would be able to get access of, certain schemas within DB, and, then on front end piece, like they can manage only part they should be managing.
Okay. Yeah. And, sometimes that is the answer, right? Sometimes it's not just silo versus pooled. Sometimes
That's
there's
correct.
different layers of your application, right? You might have
That's
shared
correct.
compute, but, completely isolated or siloed storage. And we do see that a lot in highly regulated industries. And I got a couple questions here I want to pull up. These may or may not be a perfect fit for your application and what we're talking about, but they are interesting questions. Do you have any sort of security parameter like a firewall? Or how do you think, maybe a better way to put this question in terms of what I've heard from you, where do you think about the security boundaries of your solution? And what services do you use to set those security boundaries?
Yeah, so we with control towers, like we would have one parent account which ultimately take care of, all the security aspect of your cloud infrastructure.
Mhm.
We use, WAF specifically. We define all the, roles within WAF within AWS firewall. We use security center to monitor everything around security.
Good.
That's where you got to know more about what's happening within your cloud infrastructure. Apart from that, like we generally define all the policies upfront, like who should be able to do what within cloud infrastructure. We don't want anyone to just come in and, create anything within our cloud infrastructure. So we define policies around, like type of instances that you can create as a, like whatever roles and policies has been assigned to you. But those policies has been coded as infrastructure as a code, and, that will provision people to do certain activities within the cloud infrastructure. Apart from that, like, we have boundaries around networks, right? So
Mhm.
if you have multi-tenant system, each and every network will take care of individual tenant, and, then we connect it with VPC pairing with the master account. So, but that's how we do it. Another portion is the compliances, which is very trickier one. So we use AWS config where we define all the rules. Imagine that your system needs to be HIPAA compliant or, PCI compliant. You need to define those rules and make sure that those are getting verified automatically rather than you're doing it manually, right? To ensure that your system is compliant enough. So we define all the rules, and then we set up, automated alerts within cloud infrastructure to make sure that we get the notification when we violate any sort of these rules. So this is what we do from, security perspective.
That was great. I think you went a little further than firewall, which I was hopefully is where they were trying to go. It's like, how are you
Yeah.
setting those boundaries? I heard WAF in there. Config is a good one. I don't often hear customers starting at config, but they really need to get there. And I also heard you say HIPAA. Any security compliance frameworks really start with config on AWS. And it also queues up my next question really well. So I was going to glom onto HIPAA there because I'm kind of curious. We work a lot with healthcare companies lately. We're hearing a lot of, for a long time, healthcare and SaaS, there was a lot of friction. People weren't really adapting the way that we thought they should be because of all of the compliance and security concerns. But I'm curious if you have any healthcare customers and use cases that you could talk to, and whether some of these same practices for security that you've just been talking about apply to those customers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, healthcare is obviously huge. We've done healthcare IoT. We had a connected nebulizer for Bluetooth for kids who needed to use that, reminders and
Wow.
everything. So we've done IoT healthcare. We've done telemedicine for live streaming. So it touches on a bunch of different internal industries as well. One that comes to mind that I think is kind of great when we talk about architecture. I'm working with this customer right now who has a platform for parents of preemie babies. So babies that are in the NICU, they every single day essentially get a doctor to go in and check on the status. And so this amazing founder, she's a medical anthropologist, has built this platform that lets you basically assign a color to that stage to make the parents feel like they understand the complex medical information in a better way. What that means, though, on the back end is they have this interesting two-sided marketplace for their customers. They have a customer, which is the hospital, and they have a customer, which is the parent, right? And they have to satisfy both of those customers. And so what that
Right.
means at an architecture level is we have to have things set up on the back end to support multiple hospitals with multiple babies, multiple hospitals with multiple babies with multiple parents, right? So there's this kind of like cascading effect of all the different data access levels that you have. They also have nurses and different practitioners at the hospital who need access to only their hospital's data so that they can view kind of like what the stages the different babies are in. They also can provide things like learning information, tips, videos, brochures digitally through this admin portal that we built. So there's a lot of different things happening, right? You've got the main company themselves as an admin panel. You have the hospitals that have an admin panel. The parents have access to a mobile platform. And then the nurses have access to a completely different admin panel. And they all have to speak with each other, have data governance across all the different pieces of data that they're storing. So we came up with this really cool system where each of the hospitals is treated like a separate workspace. So all of that data is siloed, unique to each hospital, but
Okay.
they're put in a database in such a way that that individual hospital's data can then be presented to that hospital to see how many babies do they have in the purple stage, how many babies in the orange stage. And we actually do predictive analytics on it to figure out how
Mhm.
quickly the babies can leave the hospital. So actually, there's
Okay.
another customer here, which is insurance providers, who can even actually go in and figure out based off of the data that we're providing them, um, how quickly do specific hospitals move babies in and out of care? Is there a cost savings once you hit a certain stage? Different things like that. And it all comes down to where are we storing this data? How are we storing it? This is protected health information at the end of the day, especially because it contains things like the baby's name and their date of birth and
Mhm.
all of that information. And so we have a really tight system built on the back end to actually protect all of this information while still giving it to the people who need to have it when they have it.
That's really interesting, Justin, because when we talk about multi-tenant solutions, we're usually just talking about tenant isolation. So I'm a tenant, you're a tenant, Aaron's a tenant, and we can't see each other's data. But in this case, we're getting more into permissioning, right? We're getting
Right.
away from just this isolation, just like, hey, I'm going to give you each of us our own accounts. Nothing is going to cross. Some things are going to cross now. Like we're going to actually aggregate some stuff. We're going to set specific permissions. How did you guys build a permissioning solution that complex to allow all of these different audiences to potentially see sensitive data that isn't in their tenancy, if you will, but still that they should have access to it because they have permission to?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things, and you're hearing me say this a lot, is whenever a customer comes to us with a challenge like this, one of the first things we do is just talk about the users. Who are the customers? Who are the users? Let's break them up
Right.
into user personas. From there, we just go to a basic role-based authentication platform, right? So we're looking at, who has access to what, where do they have that access, and how do we give it to them? And so, in some ways, some of this data might actually be anonymized before we pass it to a certain role, right? So that
Right.
role may not have access to the actual data. Hospital administrator, we're looking at, EMR, right? They have everything. They've got the
Right.
records. The hospital admin can look at it. However, the insurance company, they need to see an anonymized version of this data. And so we actually have to strip all the PHI out. There's some really great AWS services that do this, like Macy. So we can actually do this inside of AWS, which is great.
Right.
Strip that PHI out, give that to the customer in a way that is valuable information without breaching any, PHI or any personal details. So that role-based authentication, system that we build, very common with a lot of our customers. It's one of the first questions we'll ask is, who are the roles? what can they do and what can they not do? And then from there, a lot of times that's really what drives a lot of the architecture is, well, here's the users. Okay, how does that impact our architecture? How are we going to build this out so that, we don't ever accidentally cross wires where we shouldn't?
Right.
Here, and I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so SSO is bigger part of it. Big question that we need to ask: what kind of permissions that we need for a particular user, and that is all getting handled through Cognito within AWS to define different roles, different permission for different tenant, and then from there, making sure that people are getting authentication through the system and authorized to look at the information within the system, right? And if they are not allowed to, they shouldn't go beyond, those boundaries. So we do that. We handle, all this sort of thing using AWS Cognito. And then at the data level, like we have policies defined for, different sort of buckets or different databases. Those can be accessed by someone in multi-tenant system. So that portion is getting verified by policies. If you are not authorized to see bucket that belong to other tenant, right, within the same system, then you won't be able to access it. So that is getting handled through the policies.
Right. And IAM really is the backbone of all of the security systems we build on AWS, right? I'm curious, and I'm just going to probe a little bit here. I've been really looking into Amazon verified permissions lately. And I'm sort of curious to see, because it gets past IAM into more of the granular permissions. I'm curious if you guys are looking at it too, if you're playing with it yet, or if it's on your radar at all.
Not really, but I would love to.
I played around with it and immediately went, whoa, this is complicated. So much different than I am. So I actually disabled it very quickly because I couldn't figure it out. So it's actually on my to-do to get back in there and play with it again.
Let me know when you do. I've kind of been itching to get in there and play with it myself. I took a quick training on it. I mean, these domain-specific languages are like learning a whole new domain, oddly enough, right? Like we've got to learn a whole new language. I did it a little with OPA as well. I found it to be interesting, but learning those languages is not straightforward. So anyway, let's put a pin in that and come back to it, because that's something I'd like to talk about at a later date and see if we can find some good use cases for AVP. I think I really like this use case we're talking about, but I'm kind of curious, we've been talking about some very specific spaces. I'm thinking sort of large enterprise spaces. Do you have some customers who you've had to deal with at a very large scale? Now, I know we talked about the 500 customers or with the live streaming. That's a pretty good scale. Is there anything that kind of exceeds that scale where you've really had to worry about how you grow and scale a SaaS solution?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak directly about one that has an interesting scale, and that's in gigabytes. So we built this platform for a major hotel brand that would allow other vendors, even outside of our own as us, to actually deploy software solutions to essentially like a store. If you think of like the App Store, the Google Play Store, Steam Store, something like that. And so it's very multi-tenant in the way that each vendor has their own login. Inside of that login, they can upload multiple pieces of software. These are typically like 20, 30 gigabytes each. Not only do we store that copy, though, but the whole point of the system was actually essentially like a BitTorrent style download and patching system where they could upload another 30 gigabyte copy, but we actually would detect the differences between the two copies and actually only download the relevant information that we needed for the new software. You could include patch notes and change logs and all of that good stuff. You had essentially some level of media control where the vendor could put in like a teaser video or screenshots for whatever they're building, and then that's all put into a CMS. That CMS is the back end that's actually driving the front end application, which is actually a desktop Electron app that we built for them to download the different software on all of their machines. We then built a remote, a mobile app that was actually a remote to remotely control the software. So wherever they had this stuff installed on the different machines, there could be essentially a proctor who is available for all of the software was for corporate training, right, at the enterprise level. And so they could actually control what each of the participants saw on their screens. They could determine which software was launched at what time. And then they could obviously manage to see if there was updates available. And all of that was available to both kind of that customer on the front end side, and then the back end on the vendor side for them to manage all of their software, remove releases, add releases, queue releases, schedule them for download and all of that thing, those things. So really, really intense system. And one of the biggest things we had to worry about was storage space. It was a lot, gigabytes and gigabytes of data. The average vendor was putting maybe 10 pieces of software up there and multiple versions of those softwares, and each of them 30 gigabytes or more. So having to manage all of the different data and having a really robust system that was clean for the end customer, where you're not downloading 30 gigabytes of data every single time, it was a really interesting, challenge that we needed to solve. And so it was really cool software. It's actually sitting live in the headquarters of this company now. They're still using it today. So it's really neat. I can go there and visit and see the thing in action.
That's pretty awesome. The large storage problem is common for SaaS providers, and keeping the costs of that low in particular are problematic. What solution did you guys come up with to try to keep the costs low, but still keep all of the data available to your customers and their tenants?
Yeah, it really depends on kind of data that we are talking about. So there can be, large number of logs. Let's imagine that you have, S3 bucket where you are storing each and every activities and each and everything related to product over there. So logs can be easily, grown a period of time, and then it becomes it start reflecting into the cost, particularly. Apart from that, there can be, like, if you are building, let's say, system related to media, where you have large set of media is available, or that you has been stored within S3, then like even that size even will be grown over the period of time if you have versioning enabled and those sort of stuff within the storage. So what you need to think about is, like, whether that data uh, makes sense to keep it there for longer period of time or not, right? Sometimes you just need those data for temporary purpose, and sometimes you need to store those data just as a backup purpose, right? So for that, like, you need to choose your storage class wisely, right? Whether you need those data geo redundant or not, because that would ultimately impact into the reflects into the cost. Another portion is like how fast you need those data retrieval, right? So you might need those data at real time versus you're fine with some sort of latency there. So according to that, you need to choose the right storage class there. And then, like, you need to think about archival mechanism. So how frequently you want to archive those data, and from archival storage, right? How frequently you want to just destroy those data. So applications where you are building something related to, let's say, data engineering, where you're pulling data in from third parties just as a temporary storage within S3, and then you put those data into the backup storage, cold storage, and then you destroy it after some times, right? So that's how you'll be able to manage the storage cost within S3. But it really depends on the type of need that you have, whether you need redundancy, and whether you need faster retrieval, or you're fine with latency, and then think about optimization of logging and all sort of those sort of stuff would require temporary storage, where you keep it there for next few months, and then you destroy those. If you have, let's say, compliance setup within cloud using AWS config, then even that log will be stored within S3. Even that can be grown over a period of time, which you need to destroy. So you need to think about all those scenarios, and then optimize your storage accordingly.
Okay, that's a great answer, and exactly what I was looking for. There's always the depends. I have yet to have a SaaS question that doesn't come back with it depends. So I'm glad you do too. I'm glad it's not just me asking it depends every time. I have a really interesting question that came up here in the chat about the common errors. I'd even say the pitfalls of SaaS in general. And Justin, I'm sure you've seen a few of these along the way. I'd love to hear a couple examples of some of the mistakes that people make as they're building SaaS, and how you've helped them avoid them, perhaps even as well.
Oh, well, I'll give you even better. I'll tell you the mistakes I've made in SaaS.
Perfect.
Probably the biggest thing that I ever see is the standard startup model, right, is move fast and break things, right? And so
Right.
a lot of times when you're not taking time at the very beginning to do a good architecture setup, you have that move fast mentality. You can get yourself into a lot of tech debt, or architecture debt, if you will, that's very hard to get out of. And what I mean by that is one of the biggest things that I've seen specifically in like B2B SaaS in particular, is if you ever need to go sell that solution to somebody else, or you want to get a big enterprise client, a lot of times
Right.
they require that it runs inside of their infrastructure. So we would go to guys like Google and they'd say, this is fantastic, we have no problem running it, but we need to run it in our server setup, right? Or
Right.
we'd go to Hilton, one of our hotel clients, and they say, hey, we have an AWS account, we have to run everything you build in our AWS account, right? And so when we were doing that as Simform, it was like, okay, fine, like we'll just deploy it there. When I'm building as a SaaS solution, though, and it's in my AWS account, and now suddenly I have to worry about deploying it to somebody else's, and I have third-party services that I'm paying for silly stuff, transactional email, right? And I didn't use the SES for that. I used, I don't know, Mailgun or something, right?
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, I can't just simply deploy that to somebody else's ecosystem, because now I have another tenant that's going to be using this API key that might breach some SaaS subscription I have for that transactional email service. And so one of the biggest pitfalls that I've learned is just kind of like the duct taping effect of just like adding stuff onto your startup left and right because you're trying to be very agile, trying to be fast. And then when you finally get to a point where someone's like, I love what you've built, I'd like to buy it. And you go, oh, it's not really set up for that. Like we didn't really plan to move it out of our infrastructure. This is a fragile, perfectly, placed vase. And if you tip it a little bit, it's going to crack. So that's probably the biggest pitfall I've seen, is making a lot of decisions early on, especially reducing your number of third-party services. Like that's one of the biggest things I tell early stage SaaS startups today is, look, like I know that there's a million different services out there that you can use. The least amount of them is preferable here. And the reason for that is that whenever you need to deploy infrastructure as code or whatever it might be, and you've got a bunch of stuff that just doesn't fit that mold necessarily, it's very hard for you to pivot and move out. And one of the biggest reasons for this, when we talk about compliance, is GDPR. It's incredibly difficult to take something and sell it to a UK, Europe-based company, because of all of the compliance rules that you have around GDPR. If you have not taken a lot of that, I guess, risk on at the very beginning and say, we're going to build this thing with this in mind, it's really hard to do it later. And a lot of that has to do with setting things up in such a way that inside of your infrastructure, it needs to be like this. And as soon as you move something somewhere else, that could be as simple as your S3 buckets and having like multi-region support off the bat. It's not incredibly simple to take something that never had multi-region support and just like slap it on all of a sudden, especially when you might need to silo data away from certain customers, not mixing EU data with other data, having a plan in place when someone clicks that they're from the EU, it goes to a completely different infrastructure setup. So yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing that I've seen is making a lot of decisions early on, because it gets you from point A to point B, and not realizing that you may have to start from scratch in 6 months or a year when a bigwig comes around and says, well, we need you to deploy this inside of our black box. You go, oh man, I've got licenses and technology and infrastructure that does not support that at all. So I really suggest thinking about scale. It's one of the biggest things that we talk about at Simform when a customer comes to us and we go, that's great, but like, where's this in 5 years? Like, what are you thinking of this thing will do in 5 years? Because we shouldn't have to rebuild it, right? We should be able to build you a base that we can just continue to build upon. So we always are asking our customers, like, what's that next step for you? I know we're not going to do it now. Don't worry. I'm not trying to add scope, but I need to know it in my brain so that we can architect this way so that we're not having to start over anytime soon.
It's a great point, Justin. I think just sort of trying to summarize and think about what you just said, looking around the corner and seeing where your customers are going to be. Is it at a different region? Is it a different industry? What are the requirements for those industries and regions? And anticipating that. And this is one of those areas that as a startup, we don't really have the wherewithal to know. Right? We often don't even have product market fit. We often don't know what industry is going to buy our product. Yeah. And that's actually, I mean, not to toot your horn, but this is actually where a partner can really help. The experience that you guys have, that AWS has, that we can help you to understand maybe where we've seen your industry going, where we've seen products like yours go is a valuable conversation. So for Therabaros, if I'm saying your screen name right. I think that's an important point. Talking to someone like Justin early on and getting some advice from a mentor who's been through this journey really can help you to see around those corners, because those are exactly the type of common errors we see as well. I think pricing your product incorrectly and not anticipating how much it actually costs to support your product is just another one I would throw in there that we've often seen happen. We wait till too late to figure out whether we're actually going to make money on our product or whether we just get a lot of customers. So that's another area I'd throw out there just from my own experience as well. We're
Yeah, so
getting down.
taking,
Go ahead,
I
Mike.
would add few things, right? So like taking the right tenants and tracking the separate cost. If you have multi-tenancy, people don't do it initially, and then eventually, you would need to generate separate bill for your customer. You need to track the cost separately. It may
Yes.
happen that even you might have different size of the infrastructure for different customer. So that will be the ongoing challenge to track the cost by the customers, right? And then
Right.
another thing is like the monitoring of each and every tenant. So you would have different services in individual tenants. So generally, like people would set up, the common dashboard for all product, but it won't be at the tenant level. You need to make sure that you have
Right.
proper KPIs defined for individual tenants that you have to make sure that you are getting notified when something happens only to that particular tenant. Another
Yeah.
thing is like policies and security. Really, you need to draw those boundaries from beginning itself, because you need to make sure that you don't expose data from one tenant to another one. So either you can follow the hub and spoke model where you would connect different networks to isolate the data between different tenants, or you define the right policies. If you have everything within the same setup, then you need to define the policy so that no one can access what they don't need to, and we restrict at that level. So those are the some of the common thing that I have seen personally.
That's great. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground there. I think the idea of cost and pricing, security is, I mean, if you don't do anything else, if you ignored everything Justin and I said and just did security, at least you'd have that going, right? Because the moment you leak tenant data to another tenant, that's usually about when your product is done and no one's going to trust you after that.
Yep.
So I really like that approach, Aaron. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's a really good overall approach. We're getting down toward the last 10 minutes here. So I do want to maybe cover one more thing. We did get another follow-up here. So the plug and play of each part of the solutions for popular clouds, for possibly on-prem. So this is an interesting question. Are you running into customers that have both the SaaS product and on-prem? And are you trying to deploy out the same infrastructure for both? Or are you really sort of creating two differentiated products and saying, hey, if you do have to have on-prem customers, we're going to support them separately and still try to optimize our SaaS solution for the cloud? How are you approaching that today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's relatively rare that they have both. They're usually very gung ho in one direction. It does happen.
Right.
I would
For
say
sure.
that typically what we would do in that case is more have like an edge server that's connecting to the cloud instead of trying to have a completely different solution that happens to run there.
Right.
We hear all the time like the big questions people ask is like a multi-cloud setup. It's like, man,
Right.
that is so much effort and it's usually not worth it.
Right.
Right. So we're usually saying, look, we're going to stick with AWS. And if you have something that requires an on-prem setup, we can containerize this stuff and start talking back and forth through some, edge servers. But it's
Right.
very rare that we would not leverage an AWS service on purpose, just so that it can eventually run on an on-prem solution. Our goal is really taking people from on-prem to the cloud. We're trying to push that direction, not really support the other direction.
Right. Right. And you said containers. There's always the container options.
Yeah.
I've heard some customers doing like K3S and other very lightweight solutions for edge. And we talk about agents sometimes, right? Like you are going to have things that live in the wild. IoT is a perfect example of that. There are things that live on the edge, but I like your approach. If it can live in the cloud, let's put it in the cloud. If it has to live in the edge, let's figure out that case and make it specific to that, not trying to reinvent the wheel and push everything from our solution into the on-prem solution. So that's a really good approach for that. Now, We're getting toward the end here, and I want to make sure we covered at least a little bit more about some of the solutions. I did hear you say, Heron, before a little bit about KPIs and metrics. One of the topics that keeps coming up for me lately is cost. Everyone's become very cost conscious with this economy. Everyone's aware of cost optimization, but also developing a deeper understanding of the cost of supporting their product. We're hearing more and more VCs putting pressures on startups to show that they're profitable, show that their product is actually making money, and that they're actually selling a sustainable product, not just growing for the sake of growing in the hope that eventually someday they're going to make money. So I'm curious to hear if you've gotten a lot of questions about cost allocation and cost optimization from your customers. And if you had, how are you dealing with those? And have you found any solutions that have been helpful for your customers?
Yeah, a lot of we are getting those kind of requests a lot, because it really happens because of over provisioning of the resources, right? So we always start with billing whenever we need to optimize the cost. We study each and every portion of it, each and every tiny details over there, like kind
Mhm.
of network usage that you have, kind of services that you have provisioned, and like whether those services are on demand or whether you have provisioned it up those upfront. So all those sort of parameters that we analyze, like kind of disk usage and all those sort of stuff. So we start from there, right? We
Okay.
study the bills, and then we decode it basically, right? And then we analyze each and every service individually. It always start with the modernization strategy, where you have, let's say, imagine you have EC2 instances. We suggest customer to move to the containerized environment, because that's how you will be able to utilize CPU more, right, compared to what you have directly within the
For
EC2
sure.
instances. So we push for them to adopt the container strategy. So that is one thing that is really effective. Another thing is, like, we study type of or generation of resources that you have. So older generation of hardwares are like kind of bit costly compared to performance that you are getting, right? So if you take example of graviton instances, like those are way more cheaper and performance
Mm.
efficient
Yeah.
compared to older generation of hardwares. So we analyze those things, like how they provision and what kind of hardwares they have used from cloud infrastructure. And from there, like, we study the network, right? So whether you are calling anything outside of your network, or whether you have requests across the services, and because of that, like, you have bigger kind of, are you getting bigger cost within from AWS infrastructure, specifically for the media storage and those kind of use cases. So we define all the caching strategy, and making sure that we have temporary storage. We avoid sort of calls across the VPCs and those sort of things, to avoid the cost there. But
Nice.
I mean, those are rare cases; those are not the default one. And then we look into the disaster recovery and backup solutions, and how frequently you keep those backups within infrastructure, because sometimes you will have lot of older images and older infrastructure resources available within the infrastructure, and you are getting just cost because of those. You are not really using those resources, right? So we look at the usage and kind of usage pattern, etc. So we analyze those things, and then based on that, we optimize the cloud infrastructure for the efficient cost efficiency.
I like your approach. There's the modernization lever. If they have the time to re-architect, to rebuild, going to
Yeah.
containers, going to serverless can save a lot of money, but also just really turning a fine comb onto your infrastructure and taking a look at what you're spending and why. Sometimes we are spending a lot of money on infrastructure simply because it's what we've been doing, right? So, hey, we knew how to do this on-prem, or we knew how to do this in our VMs. Now we're doing it the same way, just revisiting those things and asking why the traffic is flowing the way it's flowing, whether we need those things is really
Mhm.
valuable. And one of our old friends here, Chris, has just popped in. I'll just put this up here because Chris is a regular on the show and often hosts for us. And intelligent forecasting, I think that's a great term for thinking about how this, how do we possibly build? How do we scale? How are we thinking, and how do we break down those costs? And that is a cost allocation or a unit cost conversation as well. So Chris, I think that is a great answer, and I'm glad you chimed in with that. But with that, I think we're coming down to the last couple minutes here. So if you don't mind, Justin, I have a couple things I want to ask you. First, obviously we're getting a lot of interaction from the audience here. People like talking to you and Heron. Where could they meet you in person? So, I mean, more and more we're getting back out there in person. Where could they meet you? Where are you guys going to be in the near future?
Yeah, definitely. We'll be at reInvent for sure. I was just booking hotels, I think, yesterday. So we'll definitely be at reInvent. I'll be there for sure. We've been going to a lot of these AWS partner summits. I just got back from one in New York City. So, whenever these things are happening, you will typically find myself and a couple other members of my team there. So you can always, expect to get a lunch with us. We're happy to talk to anyone. I'll buy you a real nice lunch, so feel free to ping me. We'd be happy to chat with you at any of these events.
All right. So with that, we'll be back on in 2 weeks, August 17th in APJ, August 16th in North America. Join us for a conversation on SaaS and AWS Private Link with AWS SA Mark Promens. With that, thank you very much, Justin and Heron. It was great talking to you. We look forward to hearing more about what you're building and having you on again, hopefully in the near future. All right. Take care, everybody.
Awesome.